From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Afghanistan, 1 year later. August is the first anniversary of the chaotic and really disastrous U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan last year that saw the Taliban take power and 13 American servicemen and women killed in the withdrawal. How is that country faring now? And what have been the consequences of that withdrawal for U.S. power and credibility around the world? Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot here with my colleagues Joe Sternberg and Kim Strassel. Talking about Afghanistan is a painful subject for many, but it's being discussed widely again on the first anniversary, except for the White House, which doesn't want to say too much about it. Joe Biden hasn't had much to say about Afghanistan at all since the withdrawal, and I guess with good reason. It's, in my view, the single biggest debacle of his first 2 years. Certainly doesn't want to dilate on that very often. Let's listen to Mike McCall. He's the House Foreign Affairs Committee ranking member and would be chairman if Republicans take the House next year.
The State Department probably didn't have the resources it needed to carry out an evacuation of this size and enormity. They had 36 consular officers at HKIA trying to process hundreds of thousands of people. They were overwhelmed, but there are so many mistakes. The biggest one, Margaret, for me, having lived through it, were, being in the classified space, listening to the intelligence community tell the story about this is going to be imminent. It's going to fall sooner rather than later. The military told us the same thing. And then we went to state, and they paint in the White House a very rosy picture. There's a disconnect between, intelligence on the ground and what the White House is doing. I think in this report, this says it all. Like, there's no way we're going to evacuate embassy personnel from helicopters like we did in Vietnam. Yeah. And of course, we know that happened.
The congressman was talking about a Republican Foreign Affairs Committee report on the exit. The House Democrats haven't really wanted to investigate what happened, but the House GOP has and has issued this lengthy report, which the White House is preparing a rebuttal to. So we'll see what those have to say. But there's no doubt, Joe, that the exit was a fiasco and that the administration was not prepared for it, as Mr. McCall says. And a lot of that has to do with the utter dogmatic determination of President Biden. We know he just wanted to get out, and he wanted to get out by a date certain. And that led almost inevitably to a rushed exit that wasn't adequately prepared for what happened when the Taliban surged to the city limits of Kabul.
Yes, and this points really to what I think is one of the big problems and also the great dangers with President Biden's foreign policy, which is that he seems to think that he is often the smartest guy in the room on a lot of these foreign policy issues that might be related to his long time looking at foreign issues when he was working on these things when he was in the Senate. But he really does seem to have been the driving force for this withdrawal. He was absolutely convinced it was the right thing to do. And that is a particularly ironic outcome given that the two things that he was elected to do in terms of foreign policy, in contrast to the Trump administration he succeeded, was to be more competent. And then also there was this notion that the U.S. needed to rebuild its relationships with its allies abroad. And his biggest foreign policy decision, this withdrawal from Afghanistan, exposed how hollow both of those promises were, because this was not a well thought out plan, either strategically or understanding what the long-term implications would be, or just planning how it would happen when they were doing it. And I think part of that also is that they have just failed to understand how this was going to look in the rest of the world, how it was going to undermine America's standing with its allies or in the eyes of our enemies.
Just to follow up on that point, Kim, that Joe makes, the operating assumption, I think, that the president had, and he was asserting this publicly, was that if the United States reduced its commitment to Afghanistan, it would be able to turn those resources elsewhere, especially to the Pacific and China, and not have to spend so much to defend against Taliban insurgency in Afghanistan. But the flip side of that is that the way we left Afghanistan meant that U.S. credibility was really damaged, and that's the credibility about our staying power on behalf of allies. And, of course, that has implications for the rest of the world. And I suspect, although I can't be sure, that this is one factor that could have influenced Vladimir Putin when he made the decision to invade Ukraine. He might have figured that the U.S. wouldn't respond with the force and aid to Ukraine that it has. He was wrong, of course, but I suspect that our Afghan exit undermined the U.S. ability to deter Putin in Ukraine.
Yeah, and I think that that's maybe just the beginning of the fallout from putting us in a position where we looked weak on the international stage. You can argue that a lot of the increasing belligerence that you are seeing from China, particularly its response recently to Nancy Pelosi's trip in Taiwan, the saber rattling and demands to speed up the timeline for when it reunifies with Taiwan could be part of this. I think the doubling down in Iran of getting to its nuclear capabilities, of telling international inspectors they cannot come in, may be tied to this. And then you add to it as well that you have to ask the question whether or not this argument that we'll pull out of Afghanistan will still have an over-the-horizon capacity and ability to monitor what's going on in that region while we turn our attention to, for instance, China. If that's really panned out, obviously the administration's doing a bit of a fist pump over the drone strike on Zawahiri, the al-Qaeda leader. But the fact that he was back in the region, living near the guest house of the powerful interior minister of the Taliban, does raise some very frightening questions about whether or not terrorist leaders are beginning to reuse the entire area as a terrorist stronghold, a way to keep out of American eyes and ears. So there's a lot of fallout from this, and we're not getting the situation that Biden promised us.
On that counterterrorism point, of course, Joe Biden had said, even going back to when he was vice president and President Obama was doing the new deployments that I think it was 2010, he announced them, that Joe Biden opposed. He said, we can do counterterrorism with an over-the-horizon strategy. And, of course, they're pointing to the Ayman Zawahiri killing as an example of a successful over-the-horizon mission, and that's certainly true. It was a success. On the other hand, everything I've heard from the people who have access to intelligence, it looks like, Joe, that ISIS and al-Qaeda are both increasing their strength inside Afghanistan, using it to develop new sanctuaries there. We don't know how extensive those are, but they are real. And I think one of the signs of evidence we're seeing, particularly on the ISIS front, is the explosions that are taking place in cities like Kabul, where there are terror killings that are almost certainly by ISIS, which is competing with the Taliban for the control of the jihadist movement in that country and is trying to sow discontent in the sense that the Taliban cannot control public order.
Yeah, and I mean, why wouldn't those groups be doing that there right now? I mean, you can and should have a discussion about kind of how effectively the U.S. and allies were maintaining order themselves at various points in Afghanistan. But the reality is that when we were there, it was not a huge lawless territory that was conducive to this kind of terror activity. And this withdrawal has now created a situation where you have a country in that region with, by all accounts, seems to be an ineffective government. And to the extent that it is an effective government, it's a Taliban regime that is sympathetic to a lot of these terrorist organizations. You now create this zone that is available to those groups in a way that it wasn't before. And it's kind of tempting to think that right now they're all just there fighting each other, involved in these various obscure disputes and feuds that these groups sometimes develop between themselves. But I think would be naive to assume that that is going to stay there, because it has not stayed there in the past.
Well, just elaborate a little bit on that. When the United States pulled out, it meant that the CIA listening posts in the country also pulled out. Now you lack that presence on the ground with the resources to listen in on different conversations, to locate camps where new camps develop. Now, there's no question the U.S. and the CIA retain some human intelligence capability in Afghanistan. I think that was borne out by the Zawahiri raid. In fact, people on the ground no doubt contributed to identifying where Zawahiri was and tracked his movements and so on, so the U.S. could hit him when he was out on his rooftop or balcony without doing greater damage to the neighborhood, and apparently no other casualties, which is astonishing. and very good counterterror work. But without those listening posts, you just have fewer resources to devote to counterterror, Kim.
Absolutely. And if you look at the 20 years we were in Afghanistan, we certainly used those capabilities that we had in those listening posts to good effect. Obviously, in 2011, it allowed us to finally take out Osama bin Laden. It did help us being there and having that presence. Another very senior al-Qaeda leader, Abu Musab Zarqawi, we got him, countless others. But in addition to simply being able to help various Afghani presidencies help and maintain solid economy there, new opportunities for people, which obviously is very much not the case of what is happening at the moment. So you put together the list, Paul, of all the bad things that have come out of this. What you just mentioned is one, but the list is very long indeed.